I have zero knowledge of Canadian studies, and some bare knowledge, I think, of English. Didi, a cousin to one of my closest friends who's unfortunately not with us. And B. Hariharan. Hariharan has been my friend since, I think, 2 decades. Shucharita I've known for more than 3 decades, almost 4 decades. And Hariharan also I met at a conference. And we keep meeting in conferences though. And Hariharan has been a lifesaver, as a story which I would not want to share now. But yeah, so it's wonderful to be with friends, and with the friends, comparative literature faculty have always been very, very generous and kind to me, and I consider them as friends. So I think, yeah, we're taking off from that absolutely brilliant sort of talk by Himanidhi, who has been not technically my teacher, but from whom I have learned a lot. All my learning in feminism actually came from a very long series of talk that Himanidhi gave. And I think, yes, she said it's really a keynote, as I'm sure you have registered. And in many ways, a very important thing which doesn't often happen in literature departments, a completely political sort of, pegging, remembering that literature and culture are never away from politics. And especially the question of colonialism, the question, and this is, of course, in the Canadian context, of which I knew very little, the theorists and the writers that has been spoken about, but the core of her talk, and especially by bringing in Rabindranath, I think that is something that resonates with me in a very important way. I think Rabindranath realized this very complex relationship between early capitalism, middle colonialism, and sort of imperialism, and also fascism. So even if you don't read anything, if you read the nationalism lectures, you know that how clued he is in on this. So without much ado, I'd request Shucharita, who I've never called Shucharita Di, so to give her. Will you be reading a paper? Yes. Okay. Right. So you have half an hour. Yes, okay. I'm also the timekeeper, so I'll stop you brutally at 29.
Give me 5 minutes notice.
5 minutes notice, okay, 5 minutes notice. And do we have a question answered together? Okay, so that is included within this 1 hour? Okay, right, take it. So please begin.
Hello? Okay, who also happens to be my mentor at a time when I was entrusted with the task of constructing a syllabus for Canadian literature. She was the person who really held my hand and showed me the way I should go about it. On that note, it is both an honor and a pleasure to be asked to talk in this plenary session. In a sense, for me, it's the culmination of an entire journey which I had undertaken all of 24 years back at the Department of Comparative Literature, Jadavpur University. And it's very, very significant for me that the period that this conference plans to cover, 2000 to 2020, is 2000 is precisely the year I started my journey, way back in 2000. And having to shoulder what then seemed to be a very, very onerous task of constructing, structuring an entire syllabus, a 100 marks paper in those days, pre-semester days, I was left practically clutching at any bit of straw that came my way. It wasn't easy in any sense of the term. And I started the journey armed with a lot of misconceptions and very few names like Margaret Atwood, Northrop Frye, and Leonard Cohen. These are the names that I started my journey with, prodded and cajoled by my colleagues, supposed well-wishers. And I realized that on that perilous journey, I was totally on my own. Totally on my own, and teaching literature in many different universities. But that wasn't a smooth journey either, because in most places, when I told them I was there to structure a syllabus for Canadian literature, they said, "Can lit?" And they would look at each other and ask each other, do we have a big enough body to structure an entire syllabus on Can lit? You can imagine my expression, my apprehension. Because with time I realized they were actually looking only at literature being written by, I hate to use the term here, white Canadians. Nothing else existed for them. That's where Himanidi stepped in. I visited her, she made me sit down and told me, Canada is not white. Alam, I know that technically. She asked me, do I look white? No, you don't. I am a Canadian professor. I said, yeah. That was how she held my hand and taught me everything 24 years back. And that's why when at Jadavpur University we set up the syllabus, it was a very interesting combination of indigenous, diasporic, and white Canadian. Only the little bit of white Canadian that we felt our students need to know. And the quotient that we had earlier, slowly that percentage came down, and the percentage for indigenous and diasporic literature went up in the syllabus. I have decided to call this lecture Exploring Canada with a focus on the indigenous context, because exploring Canada and understanding Canada, these are two things I have been engaging with. When Himanidi told me about indigeneity, the body of literature that was being produced by indigenous authors, mind you, in 2000 we did not have as big a body of literature as we have now. The only references I could draw on, very frankly, were politically incorrect terms like Red Indians and Eskimos, who featured on the New Year cards that used to come from Canada. And then finally, subsequently, steadily I learned that you cannot use the term Red Indian. When we looked at those cards, we never wondered why they were called Indians. But when you are on Canadian soil, you keep hearing about Indians, all in a derogatory sense. Imagine me sitting here and them telling me, you know, these Indians, they are so dirty, so unhygienic, so this, so that. And I used to get very rankled, and I said, what do you mean? I'm not dirty. And they would look at you, you are not Indian. I said, I am Indian. I'm talking about real life experience. I said, I am Indian. He said, but you don't look Indian. I said, I am an Indian and I come from India. The response was, Indiana, right? You mean Indiana? I said, no, I don't mean Indiana. There's no na, it's India. Most of them had no clue where India is, whether there's a country. Because next I was asked, which part of the US is it in? Because beyond Canada, they could think only of the US, which could have an unfamiliar, an area with whose name they were unfamiliar. So that's the stage from which the journey started, when I had to tell them that I am the real Indian from India. We are laughing. Hari, you have also been through this. Yeah, he must be recounting some of his experiences also. So that's where I started from. And for this talk here, I had told Dhiman earlier also that I would like to begin from the beginning to make matters very clear for people who don't have adequate understanding, because we hear a lot of things, but it's easier for us to put things in proper perspective if the pattern is traced for us. So before I begin on the technicalities, there's one word of gratitude that I would like to put on record. The journey to discover Canada, understand Canada, and explore Canada, it was not a journey I undertook alone. And there were 3 people I would like to formally thank for this journey. One is Dr. Debusri Dottoray, who's currently the head Department of Comparative Literature, Jadavpur University, and also the deputy coordinator along with me for the Center of Canadian Studies. Next would be Dr. Dhiman Bhattacharya, who was my PhD scholar in those early days, along with Dr. Shagota Bhattacharya. So Debusri, Dhiman, and Shagota, these 3 people were instrumental in building up what we are surviving on today at the Center for Canadian Studies, Jadavpur University. So on that note, let me move on to more academic matters. When you get to know Canada, I used to rely on historical facts. Where is Canada? Part of North America? Who lives there? I have addressed the problem of white and non-white already. And primarily, whenever we used to look for information, invariably the response we would get is the white colonizers. Nobody ever spoke about the people who were dislodged by those white colonizers. When the process of colonization started, first with the French, followed by the British, Canada was not a vacant land. People lived on that land, people who were brutally attacked, not with guns, bows, and arrows, but in a manner far worse than that. I'll come to that. So that that land could be occupied by the settler colonizers. The French were not half as brutal as the British were. And the French realized that there was plenty of land, a land full of natural resources. Peaceful coexistence was totally possible. And there is not much history of animosity between the French colonizers and the indigenous people who lived on Canadian land. But the story changed when the British arrived. Their first agenda was to drive the French away. Mind you, not the indigenous. Drive the French away, and the French, some of them went back to France. A large number moved down south and settled in what is known as Louisiana. There's a community called Cajuns there, who are originally the Acadians. And a handful of them dug in their heels and decided to stay on in maritime Canada on the Atlantic coast, which is known as Acadia. So when we talk about French literature, contemporary Canadian literature in French, there are 2 schools. We normally talk about Quebec when we talk about French Canada. But Quebec and Acadia, they are two different, clusters. And no Quebecois would like to be identified with an Acadian. No Acadian would want to hear anything about Quebec people. So that's what happened to the French. And then came the turn of the indigenous people. They were mostly moved and shoved and forced to move northwards, where it was impossible to survive because it was icebound for many months of the year. Additionally, they said Canadian indigenous life was very close to nature, governed by nature, and they would draw very heavily from nature. So winter was always a problem, and they used to use barks and wool from the sheep that they had there to make their own winter covers. And the very kind English colonizers told them, why don't you people use blankets? Blankets would help you to overcome the winter so easily. And they were very friendly, and they said, fine, okay, the next time we get a shipload of stuff from across the channel, across the ocean, we'll also get you some blankets. Thereby, shiploads of blankets arrived. Only the indigenous communities had no idea they would be infected with smallpox. And smallpox epidemic happened, and community after community of indigenous people got wiped out. That was also genocide. Genocide that Himanidi was talking about today. That was a very, very early instance of genocide. And I personally tend to think it's far worse than attacking your enemy when it's not really your enemy with bows and arrows or daggers. You play on their trust and you kill them. So this is the history. The other part which I would want to refer to today is, where did these people come from? They were not born on that land either. When we talk about indigenous people, and I don't want to be discriminatory here, but what do you notice about their facial features and their, when I talk about indigenous people, I refer to whom you refer to as Red Indians. They look very different from the people of European origin. So nowadays, in some of the recent books on Canadian history, we get conclusive proof meted out by a number of anthropologists and historians who have adequate proof to show that at some point of time, many, many years back, when the continents were reasonably close together at the north, if not connected, they actually traveled from the northern parts of Mongolia, Manchuria. They traveled across the North Sea and landed. You can imagine how many years back it happened, when the continents were more or less joined at the top or very close together, navigable on boat. And that explains the facial features and the structure of indigenous Canadians. When the colonizing process started, one route that it followed was the route of fur trade. People from Europe, to begin with, French traders, would travel to Canada to get the best quality of fur available. Indigenous Canadian communities were essentially matrilinear and matriarchal. So when the traders, they needed help to move inland where better quality wool would be available, they would be accompanied by community heads who were mostly women. And these traders would be there on that land for anything between 9 months to a year. It was not a come fly down by morning flight and leave by evening flight kind of a journey. So invariably away from home, they developed certain relationships with the indigenous women. The result was a new generation of mixed breed people who were known as the Methi, people of mixed ancestry. Originally, Methi meant mother would be First Nations, father would be French. Subsequently, the term was widened. Father could be white, mother would be First Nations. And to my horror, now I realize some people refer to as Methi to people where the mother is white and father is Indian. Okay, so it has really been widened a lot. So I use the term First Nations. When we talk about the indigenous context in Canada, there are three broad divisions. The First Nations, capital F, capital N. The original people who had originally traveled from northern parts of Asia. Next, Methi, First Nations plus Indian, mixed ancestry. And third, who should come first actually, are the Inuits. The Inuits which is the politically correct term for Eskimos. Eskimo is a politically incorrect term because it means eaters of raw meat. Therefore, it's preferable not to use that term. But normally we touch upon Inuits but have not been able to include it in our syllabus in a long way because Inuits are there in Canada, Inuits are there in the US also. So it's a pretty difficult and challenging task to draw the middle line there. So, but we cannot deny the presence. As I said, they should come at number one. Inuits, First Nations, and Methi. Now, when the colonizers realized that they had achieved what they wanted, for a long while the indigenous people kept quiet. They were assigned to their land was taken away from them. They were robbed of their fishing rights, their hunting rights, and they were assigned to reserves. That is an area, almost a fenced-in area, outside of which they were not allowed to step out at times. They were robbed of their right to education. Again, in a very weird manner. Education was made mandatory, but you have to send your children to a school, a residential school, which is located at a distance where it will not be possible for them to come home more than once a year. Okay, so in the name of education, basically they were being separated from their families. Family ties and community ties were being weakened and broken. They did not learn the skill to survive, which they usually did from a very young age. So even when annually they would come back to the community for a couple of months, they would be misfits because they will not be able to contribute to in the daily chores. Additionally, they were not even well accepted at school because they were the residential school people who stayed in hostels, and they had day scholars who had access to white day scholars, who had access to all the amenities of the civilized settler colonial society. So there would be a feeling of not having adequate things. Oh, you have not seen this movie. Oh, you don't have access to television. And you can understand what peer pressure can be like. So they belonged neither here nor there, which led to an entire generation of dysfunctional indigenous children. It was around the 1950s that they first started thinking that what about us writing about our experiences? And they realized that they needed to write in the colonizer's tongue in order to hit back at the colonizer. Because if they used their own language, most of which was already erased, it would stay within the community. It will not move out. But it's from the 1950s that we can trace a steadily emerging body of indigenous literature. 80s onwards, it was a thriving practice. But 2000, when I set out on my journey, I got the names. The books were not very easily accessible because no mainstream publisher would not only touch the manuscript, will not allow them to be sold in any mainstream bookstore. I remember the number of times I've gone to bookstores like Chapters and Indigo with a long list to be told, this book, this cannot be a Canadian publication. When I have the publication details, let me watch on the link whether any of the other stores have it. No, ma'am, I don't think you'll get it anywhere. It took me a while to realize that they had to establish their own publishing houses in order to publish their writings, and those were available only in bookstores dedicatedly run by indigenous people. No mainstream bookstore would sell their books. The other place where I could lay my hands on many such books were the used bookstores. The used bookstores, somebody has bought it, not worth it, so give it away to the used bookstore. So this is, Shati, how much time do I have? Little more. Okay. So this is the practice. These are the challenges that they had to that it is writings that we get to hear about their challenges. I don't plan to mention a whole lot of books today, but I'll just give you a few examples to show how their lives got reflected in their. She attended, Miracle was born in 1950. In 1975, when she was 25 years old, she attended a workshop where they were doing family histories. So they were put in pairs and they would each tell the other partner their family history and they would write it down. Miracle's history came out so well that they decided to publish it. But initially, publication meant it was a typewritten script which was kind of bound together and circulated. That's how we got Bobby Lee, Indian Rebel. But much later, in 1990, when the Oka crisis happened, another point which Himanidhi mentioned, when the Oka crisis happened, the base of the crisis was that the government, the Quebec government was planning to build an 18-hole golf course on the burial ground of the Mohawk people. Naturally, nobody would take it lying down. An 18-hole golf course of all things on Mohawk burial ground. And Mohawks from all over Canada joined in the protest, and other indigenous communities, they also joined the protest, and it went on for days and weeks and months. That's when the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, they did what we call lathi charge on the protesters. and they used barbed wired fences to stop them from getting any closer. So, 15 years after writing Bobby Lee, Indian Rebel, Miracle republished in 1990 the same book with a foreword situating it against the Oka crisis. There she talks about how the Oka crisis, the backdrop, can be explained through her own life history, the struggles that they had faced, how they did not have access to education, to hygiene, to how the basic survival that was being challenged. So that's one book that I would want to refer to. The other one is, I was talking about residential schools. Something else came up around this time called foster care. Residential schools, when they started getting closed down because there was a lot of protest, countrywide protest, the government, the white supremacist government, they thought of something, an alternative. That was popularly known as the 60s scoop. That is, they would have a welfare committee, child welfare committee, who would visit the homes of indigenous people, First Nations and Methi people, and more often than not, I just told you about that dysfunctional middle generation, the parents were alcoholic. So those children would be taken away and put into foster homes decided by the child welfare committee. The foster homes were white, and they had to be paid money for the upkeep of these. And most white parents would not be kind, would use the money but not give adequate education or make the kids do all the household chore and make a clear distinction between their own children and the foster children. So foster care furthered the trauma that was initiated by the residential schools. So these were very planned and systematic attempts at crippling the indigenous communities. This last reference you can come across in a book by another familiar name by now, Beatrice Mercier, In Search of April Raintree. In Search of April Raintree, two sisters, Methi origin. When you are Methi, you can take after your indigenous parent, First Nations parent, or you can take after your European parent. If you take after your European parent, that is if you are white, then you face less discrimination. If you take after your First Nations parent, then you are marked as indigenous, aboriginal, native. Interestingly, in the Canadian context, indigenous, aboriginal, Methi, and native, all three are accepted nomenclatures, unlike in our reality, where we will think 10 times before using the term native or aboriginal. Okay, Shati says 5 minutes, okay. I was just rounding up anyway because one needs to read. One needs to read widely, and the best way to read is read stories, read the novels, read the poems, read the plays. Because more than from a textbook, you'll learn a lot more through literature, which really gives you a lot of additional information, but also in a very sensitive them, feel for them, try to put yourself into their shoes, and you are better equipped to deal with the reality in that sense. We are running short of time, so I could go on for hours. Let's not get into that, but thank you. Thank you for being good listeners.
Thank you, Shujarita. Sorry for sort of doing the slaughter on time. But I think it's a very important talk. I'm sure there is much that you would have wanted to say, but I think very things that which clear the ground, as it were. Yes, and for people, especially for people like us who have zero knowledge, I think this is a very important, groundwork that on which we could sort of build. You can, I'm sure, will be able to have time to talk about it, other aspects in the course of your, in the questionnaire. Hari, we will try to keep absolutely within time. So I'm sorry about this. So it's 12:40. 36. Okay, so 12:36. So you have time for half an hour. The shorter you make it, the more time we have for discussion. Your choice. You have no idea of what I can do, how long my arm is. Okay, yes. So, yeah.
So, very good afternoon, everyone. And visiting Shantiniketan is a spiritual journey for me, and this is the second time that I'm here. Thanks to Swati, I came here some 20 odd years ago. So here I am, thanks to Deepan. And it's again nice to see Sucharita. Long time. And everyone here. So greetings from Kerala, from Trivandrum. I would like to not go down memory lane, but I would like to say that what I'm going to share with you is a footnote to the lecture given by Dr. Himani Banerjee. Because she talked about many things that I thought I'll be sharing with you, so I realized that whatever I'm going to say would be only a footnote to what she had been trying to flag for all of us. So here is a footnote. I'll be treading rather than reading on Canadian territory. We've heard a lot about colonialism, so I'll start off by providing a footnote to the whole project of colonialism and what we understand by the term post-colonial. I would begin by saying that the problematic of colonialism exists, notwithstanding the theoretical overflow of powerful post-colonial feelings and ideas composed in academic circles. That is my sidelong salute to all the post-colonial critics. Did we miss out then on the irony? Unintentional, intentional, I'm not very sure. The irony of the titles of one of those early books that launched the many thousand faces of post-colonialism. I would give one example. The Empire Writes Back. Must be a very familiar title for all of us, right? The Empire Writes Back. But I have a problem. Which empire? We never raise this question in our classes. Which empire are we talking about when you have this question, the Empire Writes Back? Or whose empire are we talking about? The sun had set long before the publication of the book on the British Empire. I don't know if we have had other empires. Or are they talking about the persistence of the colonial empire into the 20th century or even into the 21st century? This is a question we never address. Therefore, I will share a suspicion. I suspect, it's only a suspicion, right? I suspect that post-colonialism is one more way to lay claim over territory and make it a hiatus of power or habitus of power. It becomes a space to choke and murder others. Professor Himani Banerjee mentioned that, Sucharita mentioned that, who are sufficiently recognized as expendable entities. So that is the context that we have. So we are here listening to presentations on Canada. So I would like to draw examples from Canada. So we would move north, the global north, not just the global north, north of the 49th parallel, that is Canada. And when we move north of the 49th parallel, I would like to recall here something that I read on a website. It is titled, the website title is walkingwithoursisters.ca. This is the website. And I found this website murdered in the last 30 years. Expendables, right? Many vanished without a trace, with inadequate inquiry into their disappearance. Murders paid by the media, the general public, politicians, and even law enforcement. So I browsed again, and even a cursory browsing yielded very interesting information. So there were quite a number of sites. I have randomly picked 5 or 6. I'll briefly tell you what they are. There was a VPRO documentary which talked about, it's titled Where Women Go Missing in Canada. Canada's Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. It was by AJ Plus, another website. Missing and Murdered Indigenous Men, APTN News. And North America has a network of remarkable highways, and India is following suit. In Kerala, such a small place, we are building 535 kilometers of 4-lane or 6-lane. Now, for me, at this point, there's a little trepidation, because there is one highway in Canada, it's called, in British Columbia, it is called Highway of Tears. Imagine. And you can guess why it's called the Highway of Tears. I've given you the context. Highway of Tears, the unresolved serial murders of Aboriginal women. This is a full documentary called Real Crime, full documentary. There's an SBS data line. Why are Indigenous women? BC, Highway of Tears. So those are my examples. We are talking here about multiple acts of violence on memory and body. To understand these acts of violence in a, again, settler colony turned nation, a settler colony turned nation of the global north. Canada is global north, we are global south. That is what we are told. We should know something of how a land is settled. We had a lot of discussion, but I think it's important that we relate to this. How is it that you settle a land? The British never settled in India. But when they left India, we were unsettled. So let's keep that in mind. So that brings in the India and Canada dimension. Sherin Razak, she has written an article in this book. I'll be using this book as illustration. This is the book that I would like to, I have some pictures from this book, or based on that Walking with Sisters, an exhibition. So I'll be talking about that. So there's an essay here, and I'll very briefly read out something which I thought really captures the gist of what I'm trying to say. She says, a white settler society is one established by Europeans on non-European soil. Its origin lies in the dispossession and near extermination of indigenous populations by the conquering Europeans. As it evolves, a white settler society continues to be structured, referred to as preemptive strike. Aboriginal people are presumed to be mostly dead. Recall this very famous phrase, a good Indian is a dead Indian. So, presumed to be mostly dead and assimilated. European settlers thus became, that is preemptive strike, thus became the original inhabitants and the group most entitled to the fruits of citizenship. Now that is very crucial, I think, the way in which you claim citizenship. So what it does is, you have a tremendous dispossession, big dispossession happening at a very massive scale. And what it does in the process is create the idea of the available woman. And there's a word for that in Canada for this. It's a SQAW, SQUAW, SQAW. Yeah, SQAW. So what it does is it constructs the indigenous female as inherently sexually available, the SQAW, or easy. Therefore, sexually violable. So now we know why women go missing. Emma LaRocque, a very famous native professor, author, draws attention to the dehumanizing portrayal of women as cause, rendering all aboriginal female persons vulnerable. It's a key term. Vulnerable to physical, verbal, and sexual violence. Now, I would choose to retain it as it is. I would insist on the word vulnerable rather than go into the more fashionable thing. There's a very recent fashionable way in which people talk about this. We have theories coming up on this. It slips my mind. Start with P. Not perishable, but some other word. Maybe it will come back to me. If it comes back, I'll share with you. Anyway, so the violence of settler colonial sexual violence is something that one cannot overlook. And what it does is to establish an ideology that native bodies are inherently violable. And by extension, native lands are violable, inherently violated. So what happens is, you facilitate the theft of indigenous lands required for the establishment of settler colonial societies. You just need to look at the way in which Britain advertised and invited people to settle in Canada. Some of those hoardings are very interesting to read. I'm not going into those details. So what settlement did was that it made possible through a very, very deliberate process of deploying, now this is that last catch, as it were, deploying a juridical system modeled on the settler. So you have a judiciary coming in, a judicial system coming in, modeled on the settler, not on whatever was already there, because they are expendable. And it has had serious consequences. How does this impact the indigenous people and the settler? In two different ways. The indigenous were removed from the most productive and resource-rich land, and we refer to that indigenous population, refer to it as the Turtle Island. You will see the Turtle Island. So they were confined to reserves. So Britain introduced, within quotes, reservation policy in North America. And so what it did was, it was an act of disruption, living and local economies. So this is something that we had heard in the first lecture. So what it resulted in was the birth of the Canadian nation state in 1867. That's a very European kind of a thing, the nation state in 1867. And in 1876, soon after, hardly a decade, was promulgated the Indian Act. And what it did was it codified the colonization of indigenous land. Now, that is where the judicial system comes in. So, it is whitewashed, it is validated by an act which has its origin in a very different kind of a thinking, a very different kind of a rationale, a very different kind of a system. So, what it did was, it very specifically said who really counts as an Indian, which while reserve lands belong in theory to the indigenous people, the Indigenous Act extends state control over those lands to other areas, including. It happens in Wayanad. We had last month C.K. Janu, who came to our department, and she talked about this. She's an activist, and she led the tribal community from Wayanad from the front, and they had a big agitation in front of the government secretariat where they came with all their pots, cooking pots, started cooking, and there are all these laws, and the government would say that I think they are entitled to land, but they never get the land that they should be getting. So it is still a quagmire. We still have not been able to address it. So I assume that, I'm sure, I assume that this would be the case with a whole lot of tribal communities in our country. So we cannot say that this happens only in Canada, it doesn't happen anywhere else. It happens right under our very, very nose. So I would like to warn myself about that, this occasion. Now, what has happened with this theft of land? This is something that we can relate to, endemic poverty, and it has plagued indigenous nations for generations. Much the same would have happened, and you would read that in Mahashweta Devi. Right? It results in greater control by state over the indigenous nation. So you depend on vaccine and health centers and single room schools, etc. We get to read that in newspapers everywhere, no different. So what was the consequence of this act? High rate of poverty, that's one. It produced a whole lot of violence against indigenous women and girls because they are most vulnerable. Missing and murdered. They were all, many of them did go missing, many were murdered, because the act is perched on the principle of exclusion. What does reservation do? It excludes you. There's an enclave, as it were. You are there, as long as you remain there, you will get benefits. The moment you choose to come out, it's gone. So if an indigenous woman decides to marry somebody who's not indigenous, she loses all her rights. Very simple, right? It's a polished version of this. A much more sophisticated version of this is what is famously known as the Bush Doctrine. You are either with us or against us. So now, as a fallout of that, I would echo what Sucharita said about residential schools, which started sometime in 1800s, and assimilate native children into the now mainstream Canadian society. And this was mandatory between 1921 to 51. That's why she talked about the scoop. Now, that's the framework. All this is history. That's what we say. But I would like to ask, what goes into memory? This is the question that we need to ask. So, if I am to ask what goes into memory, we have to also ask this question: what and how to remember? How do indigenous people create a space to engage with stories of dispossession and violence? This is a question that we need to ask. How do members in these communities engage with this history of, as both of them said, genocide? Because that's exactly what you have. How do you remember genocide? It's not something that is very pleasant. So what do you do with it? Which means you have a central problem of reading. You have a central problem in reading. There are two things. Now, I started off by talking about the empire rights back. Post-colonial theory, now let me return to that. Post-colonial theory, as we discuss or use to read literary texts, will not be of much help. It's quite clear now. It is not a writing back, nor a theoretical rejig of the staples of Enlightenment thinking that we must turn to. which is what Homi Baba would do, which is what Spivak would do, which is what all of us claim to do. And we think that it is like a single, it's like the toothpaste that we have, you squeeze and you get post-colonialism oozing out. Post-colonialism, and that is not the way to understand it. But unfortunately, even in what we claim is a post-colonial nation, this is exactly what we do. We squeeze out tube after tube of post-colonialism in class, and all our students brush their teeth with that and mouth neocolonialism. This is my understanding. This is how I look at it. Healthy cynicism sometimes helps. So, we have to, I firmly believe that the post-colonial jig is up. And we have a lot to learn to look for something more tenable and enduring. And for me, it is this book. So now we can maybe show those slides. So there are a few slides there that will keep on moving. Even if you come to the end of it, you can start. It doesn't matter. Now I'm going to talk about this book, to learn, to see if there is something more tenable and more enduring by drawing attention to something that this book discusses. This book is Kitzdahnach, I hope the pronunciation is right, Our Missing and Murdered Indigenous Sisters. This is the result of a project. It was an art installation project that started in 2013 in Edmonton. It is called Walking with Our Sisters. It's a memorial installation of over 2,000 moccasin tops. You know what moccasins are. They are called vamps as well. And this exhibition was to honor the lives of indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit people. It was a traveling memorial that ran from 2013 to this. Each pair of moccasin vamps, also known as tops, represents one missing or murdered indigenous woman or girl from North America. Now, apart from this, there were 60 audio recordings that were submitted. And the songs were compiled and were played as visitors go through the exhibits. It's a very solemn kind of a thing. The installation space is very sacred. It's a traditional lodge space. No cameras. You don't go there shooting. No electronic devices. You enter the space by removing your shoes, and you will be smudged. It's the burning of sacred herbs. You have the sacred herbs being sprinkled there. Then we have to ask, what is the story that we hear? How is the story told? A variety of different patterns sewn on the vamps reflect the recognition of violence on women perpetuated for over 500 years by the settler colonizer. So how do you settle a people? That's the question. So what you have then here is, I would say, an enduring space for storytelling, as the WWO's installation has created over 65 beading groups in 30 years, 6 years or 7 years. Now, the potential here for a multi-generational dialogue cannot be missed. And in a certain sense, this conference also is engaged in that kind of a multi-generational dialogue. That's what Deeman said, remembering our elders. And we have one elder there who's come online. And as I do this, I think of my teacher, I think of Shastri, I think of a whole lot of things, a whole lot of narratives. We always, I think, are engaged in a multi-generational dialogue. That cannot be missed. And therefore, now that I've introduced arts, I'll also squeeze in something on art documentation. I would now like to talk about art documentation and biopolitics. I would like to show how this is biopolitics. What we have in these art installations is what Boris Groys would refer to as the creation of unusual living. Is not the result of a creative activity. It's not creative activity. Rather, the art is itself the activity in the practice of art as such. So, in such an art installation, what happens? Groys would say, art becomes a life form. Art there at that point becomes biopolitical because it uses artistic mean. What is it that the dead would leave behind? For us, that's what we think. And what is it that we would leave behind when we go? Is there a way of recalling it? My belief is that post-colonial theory, as we theorize or as we get it, doesn't or is not, will not be able to address this. So what we have then is the practice of what Groys would refer to as bioart. Bioart that is simultaneously biopolitical. Now this is the reason why I said that it is bioart, because it documents life as a pure activity. So what we have in art documentation, which is indispensable, producing, that is what you have here. What you have here is this, the production of life of the living thing as such. The documentation describes here the existence of an object. These are all objects, an object in history, gives a lifespan to this existence. What else is memory? What is it that you bring to life in memory? Do you bring anything to life in memory? So, art documentation, it describes the existence of an object in history. It gives a lifespan to this existence and gives the object, these vamps come to life. That is why it is called bioart. That is why it is biopolitics. Independently of whether this object was originally living or artificial. Irrespective of that, it accrues a certain life. And that's when it becomes biopolitics. So what we obtain here is a description of the realm of biopolitics by showing how the living can be replaced by the artificial and how the artificial can be made living by means of a narrative. And that's exactly what you have. You can keep moving this. Now, a word about such a narrative space. Yeah, I'm finishing. I don't think I'll need 5 minutes. Yeah. The space that you see here is what Groys would refer to as life space. This is life space. It is life space as it is inscribed over. This is space which has, I would say, a spark. Keep showing that. Keep showing the slides. Look at the way they are preparing it. The indigenous people recognize this. They would say that this is a triggering space. Triggering space. Because what you have here is the community transforming this space into a sacred space. That, I would say, is a very, very profound experience in healing. There is so much of memory, there is so much of life in this. Then, healing is, I would say, a reclamation of memory. I'll take a detour very briefly because Swati said I have 5 minutes. I think I'll tell another story then. Trivandrum, they spent a whole day with us and I was extremely fortunate to interview them, and the interview later did get published. But more than that, I asked them, in your writing, there's a whole lot of discussion about healing, etc. and what is this process? And she asked me in return, how dare you ask a question like this to me? You have not healed yourself from partition. You know, it hit me. I said, my God, yes. I told her, yes, the partition is a festering wound. We still have not been able to address it. And I said, I acknowledge that, I recognize that. And it was after this that we proceeded with the interview. And it was after this that I was fortunate enough to do a translation of a book on partition. It's a small book, about 100 pages, of the time that Lahore went through, with a lot of people from Kerala who were living there at that time of partition. So that was my way in which I was trying to engage with that question. That's a question that continues to haunt me, which is why I would insist that healing is a reclamation of memory. And what else is healing? It is an acknowledgement and acceptance of the unfinished stories each vamp tells. More than a writing back, the empire writes back. We have to think about that again. More than a writing back to wherever, one gets to hear. In 1991, at the inauguration of the Canadian Studies Centre in Trivandrum, which is what I think all of us have been doing, we listen and learn how to read the beating of memory. And so, my last sentence. Now, perhaps we arrive at an aesthetics of
Okay, lovely. So, thank you very much, Hari, for beading in so much, and especially the installation and the meanings of installation. We go in as visitors in a museum, but what happens to people who have whose entire racial memory is what is on, in a sense, display of what they're part of. Yes, so I think both these lectures in a way are connected. The central issue of violence and memory, violence in various forms, which Imanidi has spoken of as genocide. We've always thought of genocide maybe in a limited sense, but genocides can happen in various forms. So yes, the smallpox incident that you spoke about, which came as gift from the colonizers, and the missing sort of women, and the fact that women, indigenous women and young women were thought of as available. There's a term for that, sexually available, SPOC. Yeah, so I think we're into a very, very important core of colonial sort of thinking, or post-colonial thinkers, because they're not interested in answering those questions. Let me put it that way. So R.F. Dirlik had once said that post-colonialism happens when the third world scholar, intellectual, arrives at the coast of the West. I think that's a thing that we should, sort of keep in mind. Question our great post-colonial thinkers, not trivialize, but to take them seriously so that you can sort of therefore answer back. So we'll take questions. I have felt that, violence and memory link these two talks, but you can ask whatever question that sort of you or response.
Or the Pacific seaboard. But there is one big benefit with that. When you come up with post-colonial theory, you get your tenure. You become a tenure-track full professor. So I just wanted to add at that. So don't say that there are no benefits. You have benefits.
There are always benefits. And I think the question of violence, I personally find it deeply disturbing that people talk about violence as in the past. The violence is very much, I think,
before we move on to questions, I think thank you so much to by indigenous writers. And very interestingly, Sucharitadi has pointed out that there is a pedagogic shift, I think, after 1990s, Oka. So people like Lee Maracle, people like Janet Armstrong, they have revisited their literary cultural works post-Oka, thinking that that's probably the first documented native insurgency in Canada. Very interestingly, Himanidi have been talking about AIM, the American Indian movement, which in a way they did not have a direct influence, but we have to think about Wounded Knee massacre. We have to think about Iperwash crisis. These are all major historical crises, documented crises, which never featured or never came to our, I would say, academic practices or general practices, where we would talk about indigenous people revolting against dominant discourses. And thinking about 1990 here in India, which recontextualizes our theme of the conference, which is 1876, as you pointed out. 1871, here the Criminal Tribes Act was implemented. So across colonies, these British people were designed